Hi everybody, this is Professor John Gillespie, and this is my video lecture on the expanding American Republic. And in this lecture, we're going to look primarily at the economic development of the United States between 1800 and 1860, a time which is commonly referred to as the Market Revolution. We're also going to look at some of the judicial developments in American law that took place at this time, and then turn the page and look at how some of these developments influenced gender relations between men and women. So let's get going.
And so the first thing we want to talk about is the beginnings or the origins of the market revolution or the industrial revolution. It was not in the United States, but it was across the ocean with Great Britain. In the 1780s and early 1800s, Great Britain had the best textiling and manufacturing technology in the world. In fact, you can trace the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution to Great Britain and the British Isles. The United States was almost entirely dependent on Great Britain for its manufacturing products. And because Great Britain was very protective of its technology and the wealth that comes from it, they banned the immigration of skilled labor and, of course, the technology that leads to that labor. So manufacturing goods in the United States were rather costly and, of course, very rare. Until this guy, Samuel Slater, who was not an American but a Briton, successfully immigrated to the United States in order to make some cash. He brings with him a smuggled set of clandestine knowledge of water-powered textile mills to the United States. And there he attracts some investors and he sets up the first textile mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in 1790. Now, the factory that he set up proved to be really successful. Homespun textiles were, of course, going to be cheaper than British imports, and 13 textile mills had sprouted up in the United States by 1807. You had 80 by 1812, and then when you hit the War of 1812 and Jefferson's embargo, what that does is it actually spurs more growth because it cuts off British competition and it forces American industry to step up to meet the domestic demands of textiles. And so by 1830, if you take a look at the map, you're seeing a lot of textile mills popping up all over New England. That largest circle represents 3,000 employees. This guy that you're looking at here is named Francis Cabot Lowell, and he did more to expand the textiling industry than almost anybody else in American history. What he did was on a trip to Britain posing as an investor, he secretly memorized British designs. That's right, he put it in his mind and he brought it back to the United States using nothing but his own memory. So he raises $400,000 from various investors and he establishes the Boston Manufacturing Company in 1913. His idea is a company town in which all activity is going to be devoted around the textiling industry. The first one was established in Waltham, Massachusetts in 1814. And so the idea is mass production is the order of the day. All economic activity in the town is going to be geared toward that single industry. And Lowell's most famous company was named after him. It was called Lowell, Massachusetts, which was purchased in 1821 and later becomes known as the City of Spindle.
The Lowell system, as it became known, sought to eliminate the vice and the filth and the poverty and the squalor that are often associated with the onset of industrialization. So the Boston associates planted flowers and trees around the property. They built in windows to allow light into the factories. And basically what they tried to do was maintain, at least for outside observers, the pastoral setting of a New England countryside so that people would not be so alarmed to see the sudden presence of factories belching smoke on their landscape. They also sought to window dress, so to speak, the labor system. The Lowell system pioneered a form of labor that used New England women to do most of the manufacturing. Women could be paid less, after all. This is the 1830s and 1840s. And common culture held that they were more virtuous, less given to vice, and so the thinking went, easier to control. The Lowell Offering, which was a magazine put out by the factory, says, Girls who generally come from quiet country homes, where their minds and manners have been formed under the eyes of the worthy sons of the Pilgrims, who return again to become the wives of the free, intelligent yeomanry of New England and the mothers of quite a proportion of our future Republicans. A couple of things to notice from this document. First, the Lowell system says we are not employing hardened factory workers here that are going to come and cause trouble in the neighboring towns. These are local girls. They come from quiet country homes, and look who they've been raised by. They're tapping deep into American history and channeling the Pilgrims. And another thing that we need to notice about this document is they're going to return home again. This is not going to be their lot in life. They're going to become wives and mothers of the yeomanry of New England. And look at this. We're tapping into that Republican motherhood idea again. They're going to be the mothers of future Republicans. Well, it's not long before textile mills begin to appear throughout the country. Places like Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, New York, Delaware, and Pennsylvania all boast a thriving textile industry. You even have 200 that appear in the South, but the South is in no way going to rival the industry of the North. Mills also begin to diversify and specialize. They get into things like shoemaking, leather tanning, paper making, hat making, clock making, and gun making. Flour, by the mid-19th century, was done by a process that was completely automated. Well, the U.S. Congress took a look at the emerging capitalist industry in the United States and become directly involved in the advance of industry. Two congressmen, one from the West, Henry Clay, and one from the South, John C. Calhoun, devise a system known as the American system, in which Congress is going to support the spread of industry. Now, this involves a 25% protective tariff to encourage buyers to consume American and also to raise revenue. It also includes federal money for internal improvements. This means the United States government is going to finance things like roads and canals and turnpikes for the purpose of improving the national economy. This also includes the rechartering of the Bank of the United States, also known as the BUS. The Bank of the United States, as you know, was established by Alexander Hamilton and the Federalist parties, and we're going to continue its operations and hopefully expand them to increase the operations of the U.S. economy. In 1819, the South Carolinian John C. Calhoun was the American system's biggest advocate. He says, "Let it not be forgotten, let it be forever kept in mind that the extent of the Republic exposes us to the greatest of calamities, disunion. We are a great and rapidly growing. This is our price and our danger, our weakness and our strength. We are under obligations to counteract every tendency to disunion. Whatever impedes the intercourse of the extremes with this, let the center of the Republic weakens the Union. Let us then bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space." Things to notice about this document. First, John C. Calhoun says our growth is the occasion for disunion. He means that as we continue to spread westward, the center of political gravity and economic activity gets further and further away. And a lot of these Westerners out there are going to feel less and less connected to the country as a whole. Therefore, he says in the very last sentence, let us bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space. One of the greatest achievements of the American system is the National Road, which is also known as the Cumberland Road. It was completed in 1837 and paid for by the federal government, and that's the hallmark of the American system, is that the federal government is going to pay for, it's going to finance and sponsor these big industrial undertakings. It connects two major rivers, which are also trade routes, the Potomac, and the Ohio. And this is going to do what John C. Calhoun was hoping it was going to do. It's going to be an overland road that's going to link the economies of the East and the West, making the East and the West participate with each other and cross-pollinate each other. The American system was a blueprint for the largest construction project in American history up to this point. That is the Erie Canal, which was completed in 1825. The Erie Canal was the largest government project to date, and this one was paid for primarily by the state of New York rather than the federal government, but nevertheless took on the blueprint of publicly sponsored public works. It was a 350-mile canal that linked Albany with Buffalo, and this bridges the commerce of the Atlantic Ocean with that of the Great Lakes. Wheat, flour, grains, all going to move east, and then household goods and manufactured items coming from the manufacturing centers of the East or from Europe are going to move along the canal to go west. Prices are going to drop by 90%, making a lot of these goods available to everybody. So the Erie Canal not just facilitates the growth of trade, but it also democratizes consumer goods. One of the ways that this accomplishment was dramatized when the canal opened in 1825 was through a mock conversation that was enacted by the captain of the ship Seneca Chief, which was the first ship to sail along the Erie Canal. It was a conversation in which water was speaking to water, and the idea of nature being personified and sort of being a communicator or an observer of what's happening here. Let me show you what I mean. When the Seneca chief approached the first lock, the voice says, "Who comes there?" And the voice responds, "Your brothers from the west, on the waters of the Great Lakes." By what means have they been diverted so far from their natural course? Through the channel of the Erie Canal. By whose authority and by whom was a work of such magnitude accomplished? By the authority and the enterprise of the people of New York. So we can notice a couple things here. First, nature is talking to nature, and nature is talking about the authority and enterprise of the people of New York, dramatizing the conquest over nature that this canal symbolizes. Here is the Erie Canal system as it was completed in 1825. As you can see by my highlighting there, it starts all the way over in Albany, and it's going to connect with the Erie Canal in Buffalo. The entire state of New York is going to be crisscrossed by this canal, which is going to increase commercial activity, increase population, and it's going to make New York City the largest port city, the busiest port city in America, surpassing New Orleans. And here is a larger overview of the canals that are going to be constructed by 1860, either by state financing or federal financing, one of the two. And all of these are going to, as we're saying, going to connect the East and the West. By the late 1820s, steam locomotives began to overtake horse-drawn carriages, enacting a revolution in transportation. The first one was the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, and it began service with a steam locomotive. The first ride was in 1831, and it covered 12 miles in just 25 minutes, which was a pretty impressive undertaking for the time. By the 1830s, though, railroad construction was in high gear. We had over 10 different lines in operation. Over 30,000 miles of track had been laid on the eve of the Civil War. Here's an overview of that. Railroad track laid by 1860. I do want you to notice where most of it is being laid, although you have some tracks being laid in the south, connecting New Orleans to the north. You've got some coming out of Savannah and Charleston. Where's most of it happening? Most of the railroad activity is happening in the north and in the west. Another new technology that we're going to highlight is the steam engine, which was invented by Robert Fulton in 1807. It's going to be applied to steamships. The first is the Clermont, which traveled from New York City to Albany, a distance of 150 miles, in just 32 hours. By 1830, there were over 1,000 steamships that were crossing canals and rivers across the country, once again facilitating ease of travel, facilitating commerce, and the spread of ideas. Here is travel time between 1830 and 1860, and as you can see, all of the new technologies that are being employed through canals, turnpikes, steamships, and the like are dropping some of those travel times from about 6-7 days just down to 1. Well, for America, invention is the word of the day. In 1800, you had just 41 patents filed with the U.S. Patent Office. By 1860, that number is up to 4,357. America is so charged with industrial activity that one German visitor says, anything new is quickly introduced here, including all the latest inventions. There is no clinging to old ways. The moment an American hears the word invention, he pricks up his ears. And here's just a few examples of the things that pricked our ears. Elias Howe invents the sewing machine in 1846. Samuel B. Morse invents Morse code in 1844. Charles Goodyear, vulcanizing rubber in 1844. John Deere patents the steel plow in 1837, and Cyrus McCormick patents the mower reaper in 1834. The new forms of wealth generated by the market economy give rise to new forms of wealth organization and management. Junius Spencer Morgan, whose name we're going to hear about in future lectures, established one of the first systems of private banking, J.S. Morgan and Company. Private banking means he's going to use his personal fortunes for investment. This is going to give rise to multi-state investment, in which northern banks or northern investors put money all over the country, and in one of those places is going to be the southern cotton industry. Now, to this end, cities are going to establish what's known as chambers of commerce in order to direct, organize, and inform one another of economic activity, which is also something of a barrier to entry if you are not connected to the right people. There's going to be 10 of these in 1858. Now, what this multi-state investment is going to do is it's not only going to make a lot of people like Junius Spencer Morgan and his family very rich, but it's also going to tie northern banking success to slavery's perpetuation and continuation in the South. More on that in future lectures. I want to pause from the main narrative right now and look closely at a guy that I think really symbolizes this national development, industrial development, and national awareness that we see going on primarily in the 1820s, 1830s, and that's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, who was on the bench from 1801 until 1835. That's the administration of 6 presidents. He went from Jefferson all the way to Andrew Jackson. His decisions, as we're going to see, helped to elevate the court to a co-equal branch of government alongside the executive and the legislative. Most significantly, however, and the place that we're going to start, is the concept of judicial review. In the court case Marbury v. Madison, which we've already discussed, Marshall ruled that it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. If 2 laws conflict with each other, the courts must decide on the operation of each. This is the very essence of judicial duty. So let's pause and talk a little bit about judicial review. Judicial review means that it is, as Marshall says, the province and duty of the courts to interpret the Constitution and decide whether or not a law is in keeping with that Constitution, whether or not a law is legal. And so if the state comes up with something that is in question, then the Supreme Court will review that law and decide whether or not it is truly a valid law. And so judicial review empowers the court with the duty and the right to review anything that comes out of the executive office or anything that comes out of the legislative office. Well, Marshall was an arch-federalist. He was distrustful of Jeffersonian states' rights, and this is perhaps a little bit ironic because Marshall, like Jefferson, was a Virginian, and Marshall was even a distant cousin of Thomas Jefferson, but he did not share his cousin's radical Republican views. Marshall served in the Continental Army, and he personally knew George Washington. Now, during the Revolutionary War, he experienced firsthand what he considers to be the chaos and disorder of a decentralized state, where you've got too many leaders and not enough followers. Marshall also served as the delegate from Virginia who strongly supported ratification of the Constitution and got into several heated arguments with one of the anti-federalists, Patrick Henry. Marshall was also the one who led the delegation to France in what became known as the XYZ Affair, and he served as John Adams' Secretary of State until 1801. Now, John Adams was going to appoint John Jay as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but John Jay thought that the court lacked energy and dignity, and Marshall jumped at it. So Marshall becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1801, and in doing so, he is going to transform not only the office of Chief Justice, but the Supreme Court itself. The first case we're going to look at is called McCulloch v. Maryland, which was decided on in 1819. In 1818, Congress rechartered Hamilton's Bank. Remember, we're going to call it the bus. Now, the state of Maryland decided that in order to raise some revenue, they were going to impose taxes on a state branch of that bank. And so the question before the court, does Congress have the authority to establish the bus, the bank? And secondly, does Maryland's tax law interfere with congressional powers? And in this case, Jefferson is watching quite anxiously because Democratic Republicans hate the bank. Democratic Republicans believe that Maryland should have the right to tax it because they don't like it anyway, and the states, as Jefferson says, should retain sovereignty. Well, in a unanimous court decision, Marshall rules that yes, Congress may establish the bus. Now, in doing so, he draws on Alexander Hamilton's doctrine of implied powers, which says that there are things that Congress may do which are not explicitly spelled out in the Constitution. And the other part of his decision is no, for Maryland, Maryland may not tax the bus. The laws of Congress trump those of the states. To this end, he wrote, "The Constitution and the laws made in pursuance thereof are supreme. They control the Constitution and the laws of the respective states and cannot be controlled by them." So the ruling here also affirms the doctrine of loose construction. That's Hamilton's belief that Congress possesses implied power and should exercise those powers so long as they are in keeping with the spirit of the Constitution. He writes, "Let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional." The second court case we're going to look at is called Cohens v. Virginia, which was decided in 1821. In this case, Congress had authorized a lottery within the District of Columbia. But two brothers, Philip and Mendez Cohen, took those lottery tickets, bought them, and resold them in the state of Virginia. Now, selling those lottery tickets in Virginia is illegal under Virginia state law. So the state of Virginia tried and prosecuted the Cohens and found them, rightfully, guilty of violating state law. But here's the problem, and the problem that Marshall is going to decide on. The problem is that in their decision, the legislature of Virginia declared the state of Virginia to be the supreme arbiter in disputes between the state and the federal government. And that echoes Thomas Jefferson's doctrine of the compact theory, which says that the states are the arbiter and the sort of the judge of whether or not things are constitutional. So here's the question before the court. Does the Supreme Court have the power under the Constitution to review Virginia's Supreme Court ruling? Marshall's ruling really shouldn't surprise us. He rules, yes, the Supreme Court does in fact have the power to review and overturn the decisions of state courts, even state Supreme Courts. And so, while the Virginia Supreme Court decision was upheld and the Cohen brothers did violate the law, what Marshall was striking down was the compact theory of government, which was implied by their ruling, the idea that the states are the arbiters of the Constitution. Marshall says no, and he affirmed the court's right, that is, the Supreme Court's right, to judicial review, stating once again it is empathetically the province and duty of the judicial department, that's the Supreme Court, to say what the law is. The next court case we're going to look at is called Gibbons v. Ogden, which was decided in 1824. Here you have a New York state law, which gave Anthony Ogden the exclusive right to operate his trading vessels in state waters. So this guy who operated a series of steamships is given by the state of New York a monopoly on those waters, and by doing so, they gave him the opportunity to make a hell of a lot of money. Thomas Gibbons, who was another steamboat operator, operated in the waters between New York and New Jersey, and he says this isn't fair, and he challenges Ogden's monopoly given to him by the state of New York. He doesn't want to pay taxes to navigate the waters that the states should share. And so the question before the court, does the state of New York exercise authority to grant commercial monopolies to companies or individuals operating in water that is shared by the states? Well, again, the court is unanimous in its decision, and Marshall articulates it, saying no state, including New York, has the right to regulate the terms of interstate commerce. Interstate commerce and its regulation is the job of Congress, and he refers to what's called the Commerce Clause in the Constitution, which says that Congress has the right to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes. So among the several states is what's being invoked here in Article 1 of the Constitution, saying Congress alone has the right to regulate that interstate commerce. And of course, this is going to come into play later when we start talking about railroads. So Marshall rules that no state can impose laws on areas in which Congress has the final authority. So no, New York, you cannot grant monopolies in waters that are shared by several states. Marshall says it has always been understood the sovereignty of Congress is plenary to those objects. The power over commerce with foreign nations and among the several states is vested in Congress as absolutely as it would be in a single government, having its constitution the same restrictions on the exercise of the power as found in the Constitution of the United States. The next case we're going to look at is called Fletcher v. Peck, which was decided in 1810. This goes back to a dispute arising in 1795, in which the state of Georgia, through its legislature, passed a land grant awarding territory to 4 private companies, and they were going to develop this land, and they were going to sell it. Now, it was later discovered that just about every member of the Georgia state legislature was bribed in this decision. And so in 1896, the new legislature voided the law and declared the grant invalid. And they were doing this in response to public outcry, which said, hey, this is not a fair law, everybody was bribed. In 1800, a guy named John Peck acquired land that was part of the original grant. Now, he turned and sold that land to a guy named Robert Fletcher, and Robert Fletcher was not aware of the 1796 ruling, which basically says that John Peck is not the owner of the land. So Fletcher is hopping mad, and he argues that since the original sale of the land had been declared invalid, Peck had no legal right to sell the land and had committed a breach of contract. So the question before the court is this: could the contract between Fletcher and Peck be invalidated by an act of the Georgia legislature? After all, Peck was swindled, and the court realizes this. Fletcher was not the owner of the land, according to Georgia anyway. Well, Marshall rules this: no, the contract cannot be invalidated. The original 1795 deal is still valid, despite the fact that the circumstances under which the legislature operated are less than moral. So Georgia has no authority to impair contracts just because the people say so. Marshall rules when a law is in its nature a contract, when absolute rights have vested under that contract, appeal of the law cannot divest those rights. Now, in this ruling, Marshall is coming down hard on the side of private property and contract law. This is going to be very important to the development of American jurisprudence. Property rights are sacrosanct in American jurisprudence, and the idea of the liberty of contract and the integrity of the contracts is going to be important. The last case we're looking at is called Dartmouth College v. Woodward, which was decided in 1819. In 1816, the New Hampshire legislature attempted to change Dartmouth College, which was a private school, into a state university, which would be a public school. And so the legislature changed the school's charter by transferring control from a board to the governor. The ousted trustees of the board filed suit against William H. Woodward, who was their former board chairman, who had gone along with this and given up control. And so, does the state or the college's trustees' will prevail here? The question before the court is this: did the New Hampshire legislature unconstitutionally interfere with Dartmouth College's rights under the contract clause of the Constitution? And the contract clause is for you right here in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. It reads, "No state shall pass any law impairing the obligation of contracts." An interesting complication in the Dartmouth case is that the charter was signed in colonial times. And so one of the questions that Marshall has to contend with is, can a contract be upheld even if it was validated by the government that has been overthrown? Marshall rules in a 6-1 decision, the court upheld that the college's charter qualifies as a contract between private parties, which the legislature could not interfere with. Marshall's opinion, again, emphasizes that contracts refers to transactions involving individual property rights, not to, quote, the political relations between the government and its citizens. Again, let's emphasize that contract laws are upheld and private property is sacrosanct under Marshall's interpretation of the Constitution. John Marshall has left a lasting mark on the history of American jurisprudence. His decisions affirm many things that we now take for granted. The first is, of course, the concept of judicial review, which establishes the supremacy of the court as the arbiter between states and states the federal government. Secondly, through a series of cases, he destroyed the Jeffersonian compact theory of government, which, as you recall, held that the states are the sovereign interpreters of the Constitution. Marshall rules, no, the states are not the arbiters of the Constitution, it is the Supreme Court. Also, he formally established the legitimacy of the Hamiltonian idea of loose construction over the Jeffersonian idea of strict construction, which says Congress has implied powers. That is, loose construction says Congress has implied powers to act within the scope of those powers depending on what the spirit of the Constitution says. So it doesn't need to be spelled out for you in the Constitution for Congress to say anything. Contracts between individuals are sacrosanct, and they are more or less beyond the reach of the government to overturn. Property rights and contracts are of primary importance to John Marshall. Well, Thomas Jefferson, as you can imagine, hates all of this. He says the Constitution is a mere thing of wax in the hands of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. So Thomas Jefferson does not care for the Marshall Court one bit. A New York editorial comments upon Marshall's death: the chief place in the Supreme Tribunal of the Union will no longer be filled by a man whose political doctrines led him always to strengthen the government at the expense of the people. Well, not everybody benefited equally or at all from the market revolution, which we see occurring in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Native men tended to do better than immigrants. White men tended to do better than black men, and women were often excluded entirely from the benefits of the market revolution. Work relocated from the family farm or the family shop to the early factory system. And while this is not the case for everybody, in your urban northern areas, it tends to become more and more the norm. Hours were getting long, and they're getting longer. Work was boring, unsanitary, and oftentimes dangerous. And also, you see increased immigration from places like Ireland and Germany, which is lowering. Well, in this new market economy, the master-apprentice relationship, which characterized pre-industrial economies, it's giving way to a new form of relationship, the employer-to-employee relationship. You see, fewer and fewer people are finding themselves economically dependent. Instead, they're finding themselves at the mercy of their employer and also of the whims of an insensitive market. The owner does not share the bonds of trade with his apprentice or with his employee, but is now separated by both skill and money in a different social class than the people that work under him. An 1826 editorial in the New York Observer says, "The master no longer lives among his apprentices and watches over their moral as well as mechanical improvement." Labor is governed by a highly revered liberty of contract. Now, we've seen this already in the Marshall Court, how contract rights are held as sacrosanct by the judiciary. Theoretically, under this liberty of contract, a man could negotiate his hours, his wages, and his terms with his employer. And presumably, they act as equals. I go to a man and I say, hey, I have a certain skill. I will sell that time, that skill to you, and let's talk about what I'm going to get owed. One Protestant minister declares, "Workers are therefore left free to apportion among themselves their respective shares untrammeled by unwise laws. And there you have that nod toward the liberty of contract, saying it is within every man's right and prerogative to go and negotiate his own terms, and we don't need laws getting involved with that, right? Well, as a lot of people, especially legislators and the courts, are celebrating this liberty of contract, fewer people, especially the workers, are sharing in the benefits that it's supposed to bring. If you go to the colonial period and look at the economic situation, about 45% of the population controlled 10% of the wealth. Move up to 1845 and look at the city of Boston. There you find 4% of the population controlling over 65% of the wealth. Go over to Philadelphia, same year, 1% of the population controlling 50% of the wealth. So while liberty of contract celebrates the right of the individual, ordinary, common everyman to go out and negotiate the terms of his labor, it seems that more and more money is finding itself in the hands and control of fewer and fewer people. And so you do have people who criticize the whole liberty of contract idea as well as the system of capitalism. One of them is named Seth Luther, who says capitalism and the liberty of contract is a cruel system of extraction on the bodies and minds of the producing classes, for no other object than to enable the rich to take care of themselves while the poor must work or starve. Well, by mid-century, many workers are onto it, and they are describing themselves as wage slaves. They believe that they had lost the freedom to work for themselves, despite the idea that the liberty of contract is supposed to empower them to do just that. They did not control the pace of their labor in the new factory system, nor the product that they produced. And they increasingly are lacking the skill to demand better conditions or pay. When the mill girls went on strike in 1836, they shouted out this song in protest. Oh, isn't it a pity such a pretty girl as I should be sent to the factory to pine away and die? Oh, I cannot be a slave. I will not be a slave, for I'm so fond of liberty that I cannot be a slave. What about collective bargaining? What about unions? Could the workers unite for improvement? Well, workers had tried to organize and even stop working in protest since the founding of Jamestown. The first strike that we would probably recognize as something of a modern strike occurred in 1824 when 102 women weavers stopped working to protest the reduction of wages and increased hours. In 1825, the United Tailoresses of New York organized and launched a major strike in 1831. Approximately 30,000 workers had joined trade unions by 1830, showing us that yes, unionization or trade unions collective bargaining is becoming a tool that many workers are turning to try to improve their conditions. Men often join to defend their traditional role as family provider. One Boston Carpenters Union went on strike to, quote, maintain a family at the present time with the wages which are now usually given. The ideas behind liberty of contract and the supposed freedom of the worker and the associated values that float around in the 1830s and 40s eventually coalesce as what is known as free labor ideology. Free labor is supposed to explain why some people benefit more from the onset of capitalism than from others. And it refers to white laborers who are not slaves, not laborers who work cheaply or for free. So let's clear that up. They are free because they are free, supposedly, to negotiate their own terms and to work freely to better their situation. So advocates of free labor ideology celebrated hard work, self-reliance, and independence. And key to understanding this ideology is the claim that the door to success was open to any man who's just willing to work for it. An early spokesman of free labor ideology was Abraham Lincoln, who is a one-time Whig congressman and self-made lawyer. He says, "Free labor was just an generous and prosperous system which opens the way for all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and improvement of condition to all." Lincoln flatly denied the comparison of wage earning to slavery. He told a group of workmen in Wisconsin, "It is a mistake to insist that slaves are far better off than northern freemen. What a mistaken view do these men have of northern laborers. They think that men are always to remain laborers here, but there is no such class." And this part is key. The man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. So you can see in Lincoln's quote here, this rags to riches ladder of progress is clearly identified. This is the domain of the free laborer. This is his right and his destiny, to labor for himself, to work hard, and to rise up in the world. One aspect of free labor ideology is that it is virulently anti-slavery. Free laborers look at the slave owners of the South as lazy, dependent, and dependent on the work of others. And also, slavery displaces white workers, lowers wages, and prevents men from rising up in the world. You see, if I have to compete with slave labor and I am expecting to get paid, you're always going to hire the slave labor, and I will never rise. Now, we want to make this distinction. Free labor ideology and its anti-slavery sentiment is not the same as abolitionism. When you hear of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, David Walker, or the Grimsby sisters, they want to ban slavery because slavery is wrong. They want to ban it for moral reasons. Free labor advocates banning slavery, or at least stopping the spread of slavery, because they fear competing in a free market with unwaged slave labor. Free labor advocates become paranoid, though, of a growing slave power conspiracy which is swelling in the South. This is the fear that Southern cotton growers were trying to spread slavery west and even north at the expense of the working man. Famously, one Pennsylvania congressman said, "I would preserve for free white labor a fair country, a rich inheritance, where the sons of toil of my own race and color can live without the disgrace which association with Negro slavery brings upon free labor." Well, when we look at the map, we'll see that the industrial development took place disproportionately in the north. The textile mills, the steamships, the canals, and the railroads, all of them are disproportionately located in the north, and so the north is going to disproportionately reap the benefits of these industries and these technologies. And so the south looks to the north and becomes suspicious of the growth of industry. Why is it that the federal government is favoring the north? Why do we have to pay through our tax dollars for their canals and their turnpikes and their roads, their so-called internal improvements? And why must we be made to purchase goods on a closed market because of these tariffs that they're raising? So here's the key to the South's objection. The American system placed a 25% tariff on foreign-made manufactured goods. Now, what this is supposed to do is it's supposed to benefit American manufacturers by making foreign goods more expensive, even if they're better quality. And so, if you've got an American product and a foreign product over here, and then the American product costs you $1, and then the foreign product also costs you $1, what we're going to do is we're going to put that 25% tariff on the foreign good, and then you're going to see the higher price. and then you're going to grab the American good when you go to Big Box Mart and you see them on the shelf. Because when you see higher prices, then you, the customer, is going to favor the American goods, and in turn, American companies are going to hire American workers to meet this increased demand. But here's the problem. The South does not do a lot of manufacturing. And so here's how this scheme often works out. You see the foreign good, which is going to go up to $1.25 because of the 25% tariff that's placed on it at the port. And then the American manufacturers, they're in it to make money too. And so are they just going to continue to sell the good for $1? No, they might raise it. Let's say $1.20, $1.22, or maybe even $1.24. Still keeping the price lower than that foreign good, but artificially raising it so that they can make money. Now, if you're not benefiting from the northern industrial system, if you're not directly linked to that somehow, that means that you're buying on a closed market, and that means higher prices, artificially high prices for consumers. And because the South buys a lot of its consumer goods from the North, this means that they are buying on a closed market. So just to dramatize this, you see our big population centers are popping up primarily in the north and in the new cities of the west as canals and turnpikes link east and west. What about south? You've got New Orleans, but other than that, you have very few major population centers because northern industry is not reaching down there to the same extent that it's reaching westward. Well, there is one Yankee inventor that came up with an invention that I think kept the South from industrializing and perhaps held the South back. That would be Eli Whitney. He invented a system of interchangeable parts in 1793. He patented the cotton gin, which is short for engine, in 1797. The cotton gin revolutionizes production. It removes the cotton seeds from the plant 10 times faster than a person could do by hand. And this, in turn, increases the demand for cotton. And so here you have, by my map, cotton production in 1820. Then comes the cotton gin, making its cultivation, its de-seeding much easier, and so you see cotton production jumps in 1860. What else is increasing as cotton production is increasing? That's right, slavery is increasing alongside cotton production. So if you look at my map, you'll see that a lot of states are starting to see populations of enslaved black people at half or even more than half than that of white people. Alexis de Tocqueville was a French traveler in the United States in the 1830s. He took notes over what he saw. He commented on our economic system, our political system, slavery, religion, and even the roles of men and women. In his famous work, Democracy in America, which was published in 1840, de Tocqueville made some observations on how men and women related to one another in the 1830s. He writes, "In no country has such constant care been taken as in America to trace two clearly distinct lines of action for the two sexes, but in two pathways that are always different." He writes, "American women never manage the outward concerns of the family or conduct a business or take part in a political life, nor are they, on the other hand, ever compelled to perform the rough labor of the fields, or to make any of those laborious efforts which demand the exertion of physical strength. If, on the one hand, an American woman cannot escape from the quiet circle of domestic employments, she is never forced, on the other, to go beyond it. Hence, it is that the women of America, who often exhibit a masculine strength of understanding and a manly energy, generally preserve great delicacy of personal appearance and always retain the manners of women although they sometimes show that they have the hearts and minds of men. Well, the development of capitalism in the United States in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s brings out new ideas about gender, or about the ways in which men and women are supposed to behave in society and towards one another. You see, in a pre-capitalist society, men and women did different work. They had different spheres, so to speak, but both domains were equally valued. With the onset of capitalism, men are expected now to engage in the cutthroat world of business and competition, and women are expected to preside over hearth and home, and the ordinary functions of the homemaker are celebrated, idealized, even glorified. And this is what's known as the cult of domesticity, which prevailed in the 1830s through really the 1860s. A popular book, Advice to American Women, says, "To women it belongs to elevate the intellectual character of her household and kindle the fires of mental activities in childhood." The book also said of men, "For men, the absorbing passion for gain and the pressing demands of business engross their whole attention." So there you have it spelled out. In the 1830s through 60s, men are to engage in money-making, capitalistic enterprises and business, and the domain of women is the domestic sphere and the care of children. With the idealization of women came the idealization of her supposed sphere, which is the home. The home becomes increasingly identified and associated as a place of sanctuary and a refuge from the rough and tumble world of business that men inhabit. And so household duties are elevated to something of sacred domestic rituals. Godoy's Lady Book says there is more to be learned about pouring out tea and coffee than most young ladies are willing to believe. And in the magazines and pamphlets of the time, this idealization of the home is celebrated. Here is The Sphere of Woman from Godoy's in 1850, seeing children on the floor, baby on mom's lap, this sort of idealized depiction of domesticity and happiness. Here you have The Constant of 1851, which again, the mother is in the center, the wife and mother is in the center, and she's tending the children. And here comes the dad, or the husband, who's sort of the outsider to the home, but he's coming in and he's looking to her as the source of refuge and respite from the hard world of business. With the idealization and the elevation of the home, you also see some interesting views about women's sexuality begin to develop around this so-called cult of true womanhood, cult of domesticity. Men are viewed as base, animalistic, and hopelessly inclined to sex. By contrast, women were seen as wholesome, angelic, and passionless. One of the beliefs about women is that they should not, and in fact could not, enjoy sex. Sex is for procreation, not for recreation. So while men could be forgiven for having premarital relations or even extramarital relations, it was a social deal breaker for women. One 19th century magazine says, "One step over the barrier thrown around virtue, and the gulf below is your receptacle forever." Well, ironically, it seems that this culture of prudishness gave rise to a culture of promiscuity. The demand for pornography skyrocketed in the mid-19th century, and it was assisted in no small measure by the invention of the daguerreotype, which is the forerunner to modern photography. And perhaps there was a darker side to this suppression or denial of sex and sexual impulses, and that is, sex was driven underground. A telling statistic that shows you how in demand sex was during this time is that between 5 and 10% of women ages 15 and 30 worked as a prostitute for some time during the 1840s. How do we account for this double standard that we are applying to both men and women? Why the shift? Why does the cult of domesticity intersect with the changing economy? Well, this is my view, and you may feel free to disagree with me on this. And that is that as men lost power in the workplace and they transitioned from the domestic economy into wage laborers, and they see themselves dependent on a market, then they in turn seek to infantilize women and turn them into something of dependence. Let me demonstrate this. The Reverend George Burnap writes in his book, The Sphere and Duties of Women, she feels herself weak and timid. She needs a protector. She is in measure dependent. She asks for wisdom, constancy, firmness, and she is willing to repay it all by the surrender of the full treasure of her affection. Women despise in men everything like themselves except a tender heart. It is enough that she is effeminate and weak. She does not want another like herself. Burnap goes on and says, a really sensible woman feels her dependence. She does what she can, but she is conscious of her inferiority and therefore grateful for support. A woman has a head almost too small for intellect, but just big enough for love. True feminine genius is ever timid, doubtful, and clingingly dependent. A perpetual childhood. Well, how real was this cult of true womanhood anyway? It was an ideal, celebrated in print, but did not reflect the experiences of most women. It certainly did not reflect the experience of enslaved women or free black women, and it did not reflect the experience of working class or poor women. We need look no further than the Lowell girls to see that they're not exactly living out the ideals of the cult of true womanhood or the cult of domesticity. It masks the many realities of gender relations in the 1830s, one of which is that men in the 1830s and 1840s became less likely to earn enough to be the sole support of their families. Women often had to work in what was called the invisible economy, doing sewing or laundry in order to make a little bit of money on the side in order to support the family. Also, it denies that women are, like men, sexual beings with genuine human emotions and passions.